Well, all right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the 391st meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a once a week series that was founded by the cartoonist and educator Ben Catcher. It was founded over a decade ago. It receives funding that we're very grateful to have from the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation, so that everyone who speaks to the symposium every week gets paid. That's a very important thing to mention. The idea of the symposium is that we have someone every week who comes in who either makes comics, um, writes about comics, thinks about comics, is comics adjacent in some way. And they come in, and the symposium is completely free form. People can talk about their own work, they can talk about their own involvement in comics, or they can just talk about an issue that they're interested in that has nothing to do with comics. They can talk about a painter or a poem or something that they like, or just an idea that they want to discuss. Um, Part of the other feature of the symposium that's very important is when Ben founded it, there's kind of this idea of an interaction between audience and speaker. The symposium was kind of founded around ideas that sprang out of Occupy Wall Street, having people that might only speak in a university or speak in a way that they might only speak to a university class where you'd have to pay money, and making that free and open to the public. So that's very important to mention tonight because we are honored to have a very, very special guest for me, and I'm sure to many of you in the audience, the cartoonist John Porcellino. And part of what we'll be doing with John tonight is just having a discussion. Sometimes people have a prepared talk, but for tonight, I just have some prepared questions for John. We're going to talk about things. And so I really encourage you guys in the audience while we're talking to enter a question as we talk. And you can indicate whether you'd like to be put on screen, whether you'd like your question, whether you'd like to read your question out loud, or if you'd just like me to read the question for you. So as we're speaking, please keep that in mind. I'm just going to say a little bit about John at the top. Um, John's work, I found, I brought out my old issues of King-Cat to show to tonight's symposium. This was the first issue, issue 56 of King-Cat that I got. It came out in 1999. Just admitting someone here. It came out in 1999 when I was 15 years old or 16 years old, and I've been reading it ever since. And what I want to say about encountering this work for the first time was, and I feel like many people's experience with King Cat and John's work is similar in that seeing John's work at that time solved a lot of, it answered a lot of questions for me. I had this interest in cartooning, but I drew in a way that didn't look a lot like either the mainstream comics I looked at or the alternative comics I looked at. And the minute I looked at John's work, I could tell the skill that went into it. I could tell that the drawings were done in this way intentionally, and there was a real beauty to them. But it answered a question of whether you could draw in this kind of way with the comics medium and make it work and make it really, really beautiful. And the other thing about the way John worked was that his work primarily was distributed through the mail. And I know that in my life at the time, I was very self-conscious about making comics or sharing art with people in my day-to-day life. But I did want to communicate art all the same. And John's way of getting his work out there, sending it to people and forming a relationship with people he didn't know in his day-to-day life, but that he would come to know through sending his work through the mail, that answered another question to me about expressing yourself beyond people in your immediate life. That was a very powerful thing um, to learn. And John's work has only, as each issue comes out and each issue is read by me and many, many others, those lessons continue to be taught as you read them. And the art that John made at that time, and this was 1999. King Cat started far before that. I think John's vision of ways to get comics out there and ways to make comics um, was so far ahead of its time and still is, but I think has really its point has really been proven in comics culture as a whole. So we can talk about some of these things and hopefully talk about a lot more things with John. I'm going to read a very quick biography, a one-sentence biography that John sent along just to start us off. John Porcellino was born in Chicago in 1968. Since 1989, he self-published King-Cat Comix, a journal of his life, thoughts, and creativity. So let's all welcome John Porcellino to the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. And I kind of want to start off, John, asking you, you in addition to being an artist, you run this distribution company called Spit and a Half that sells your own work and sells work of many other people. And to me, there seems to be a unity of both projects, a unity of your artwork with what you do with Spit and a Half, that it's two parts of a whole. But I'm kind of curious to hear if you see it that way or if you see it slightly differently.
Um, yeah, I mean, to go to your earlier when you were talking about in your introduction, this idea of, you didn't feel comfortable sharing your work with the people around you or whatever. I mean, that right there was a huge part of why I think I ended up making zines was because I felt, especially when I was younger, teenager, um, especially I've had such terrible social anxiety. I was afraid to face-to-face interactions with people unless I knew them really well. I had a couple of really, close friends that I could be myself with, but with in the general public, I was very withdrawn. And making zines was a way for me to express myself because I had all this creativity, these ideas and things that I wanted to get out, and I wanted to share them with people and connect with people. But it was hard to do that for me in day to day, face to face life. And so when I started making zines, and then especially found the zine world, around Fact Sheet 5 back in the day, it just opened up the whole world to me, and I really felt like I was at home creatively. And so with the distro, it's similar in that I wanted to connect. I was connecting with people, customers who are buying the stuff, and I was connecting with readers who are reading King Cat, but I was also connecting with other artists. Um, and those artists were connecting with readers through Spit and Half. So Spit and Half was just kind of this like hub, especially in the early days in the 90s. I was just writing to Sasha Mardu. She's doing an article about Jerome Gaynor, the cartoonist, and was asking me about it. And it really did. It felt like a family. Spit and Half felt like a family. And so I would say that it's what I what I realized through many years of doing this is that for me, I'm just trying to connect with people on a personal level. And this King Cat and zines and Spit and a Half and stuff is the medium are the media through which I connect with people, that I found, this way to connect. So that's a roundabout way of saying I do think that they're connected, and I think they're connected in terms of the idea of communication, like direct communication and connection, um, between readers and artists and artists, and even readers and readers. And so, in the olden days, there weren't really shows, zine shows or comic shows to go to, which I think fills a lot of the social needs of cartoonists and readers nowadays. But back then it was through the mail, or traveling. A lot of people travel around the country and visit and things like that. So um, to me, they're both things. King Cat and Spit and a Half are about enabling some kind of connection.
Can I ask you, you're talking about how you felt about this when you were younger, a self-consciousness of sharing your work with people. Can you walk us through like the first issue of King Cat, I believe, would have been when you were 21. Can you walk us through, is that correct? 1980?
I think I was 20. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
20.
Yeah.
Um, Can you walk us through that process of I believe you did a poetry zine prior
Yeah.
to that? Can you
Yes. Yes. So,
work
um,
public in some kind of way?
I'm sorry, say that last part
Oh
again.
no, no, just the process of you have this feeling about how to share your work with people. And then the process of it's I think a big step that not everyone goes through. They have creativity, they have a desire to be creative and express that creativity. They might feel inhibited about doing so. And just making that first step is something that I don't think everyone does. I mean, most everyone we know through the world we've created around us does that. But in that moment before you did it, yeah, just walking us through the evolution of making that
Yeah.
first step.
Well, I mean, the evolution would be it's pretty straightforward. It's when I was like a little kid, like 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, I was making little books. I was making zines, right? But they were just the edition of one. I would take typing paper and fold it in half, and I'd use Elmer's glue and make a binding, and make these little books. And I would do comics or illustrated stories or just, short stories and things like that. And I'd finish them and I'd stick them in my desk drawer. And then it was my freshman year in high school, I think. So that would have been 82, where I was making these little comics, and um, my dad had a photocopier at his office. And whenever I'd go into his office with him on the weekends or wherever, I'd always mess around with that. I was fascinated by the photocopier. I'd make a drawing and I'd put it on there. I'd print copies of it and it would blow my mind, or I'd photocopy my hand, of course, or stick my face on it and all that stuff. And it occurred to me, like, oh, these comics that I'm making and sticking in my drawer, I could go to this photocopier and make multiples of them. And so for several years, I made that was my the first comic that I like reproduced for people. It was called Tales of Hogarth the Barbarian Pig. And I must have seen Cerebus somewhere because it's basically a copy of that, but I don't remember ever reading Cerebus, but I must have seen a copy somewhere because I can't believe that I came up with the idea myself. But um so it was this barbarian pig, and he had like his little squad of people and they'd go have adventures. And so I would photocopy like 5 copies of them and I'd give them to my friends. Um, and so then the next step was a few years later, after I discovered punk rock and stuff like that, which was a huge thing for me, was my friends and I started like a little fanzine at our high school called Zozo. Although I didn't had never heard the term zine, fanzine, so we just called it an underground newspaper. That was like our point of reference. And so we would, put art and comics and stories and photos and stupid, you know, commentaries about the administration at our school, and uh, kind of snarky punk inspired teenage bullshit. And so that one, then we would photocopy it and give them to people at school. And what happened with Zozo was it became quite popular at our school. And I was just talking, Austin, to you before we went live with this. My high school was huge. I think it was like 2,000 or 2,500 students or something. And what happened was, like, there'd be a new Zozo would come out, and we'd have a stack of them. Me and the 3 or 4 people that worked on it have a stack of them in our lockers, and people would come up to us in between class and say, "Wow, I heard there's a new Zozo." And it just was like word of mouth, and eventually people would come up to my locker, like cheerleaders, and like people who I'd like assume just hated me, and they'd come up and they'd be like, "Hey, I heard there's a new Zozo." I'd be like, how did you even know about this?" And then, later on in the day, someone would pass me in the class like, "Oh, I read your comic in the new Zozo. That was really funny," or whatever. And I was like, "Oh my God, like all these people are reading this little stupid magazine." And a lot of them are people well, I mean, it was a big school. I don't know these people personally or anything. And a lot of them, like I said, are people, jocks or whatever, people that I would, in my, in the grip of my low self-esteem, I just assumed that they would have wanted to beat me up or something. And so that was when my eyes kind of opened, like, oh, wow, like I could communicate with all kinds of people and people respond to it, and it's it's really direct. But it had that like the filter of um, I wasn't communicating face to face, spur of the moment stuff. I was going home and writing something or drawing a comic or making a drawing or writing an essay or something and then put it in Zozo and people could read it and there wasn't that like face to face anxiety of like they're judging me right now. And I think that was really important for me personally, just to have that little zone in between the reader and the author that made me feel a little safer. Um, and then yes, so then when I graduated from high school, I started a new magazine called Kasoiko, which was like an art and poetry magazine. It was a little less disgusting than Zozo, a little more pretentious, but still down to earth. And I did that for a couple of years, and that after a couple of years of um, Zozo was, I'm sorry, Kasoiko was when I discovered Fact Sheet 5, and then that was the moment that my whole life changed, right? Because for people who may not be familiar, though probably everybody in this Zoom call is familiar with Fact Sheet 5, it was this big, thick newsprint magazine that came out maybe every other month or so, I think. And it just listed hundreds and hundreds of zines per issue with little capsule reviews and then contact information. Um, and so, when I had a friend that I met through zines, I was selling Kasoiko at the local punk rock record store, and her name was Lainey the Oyster. She picked it up and sent me her zine, which was called Lime Green Bulldozers. And I was just like, I can't believe that somebody else does the same kind of thing. And and she lived a couple towns over, and we met, and that she showed me Fact Sheet 5, and I'll remember that moment forever, sitting on her bedroom floor in Arlington Heights, Illinois, and just being like, oh my God, people all over the world do this, and there's like a whole established network of connecting with them. And so that was that was the life-changing moment for me, when I was just like, the the opportunity to communicate or connect with people is so much bigger than I would have ever imagined. And so I got really involved in that world of zines. I did so I go for another couple of years, and then I started King-Cat, which was inspired by Julie Doucet, for her Dirty Plot zines, which I bought through Fact Sheet 5, and or found out about through Fact Sheet 5. And anybody, I know, Austin, you've done a lot of anthologies, edited them. Anybody who's done that knows that at some point it becomes kind of a pain in the ass. And it's kind of hard to herd people. So Kasoiko was an anthology. Um, at first, it started out just my friends contributing work. And then, of course, once I got hooked into the Fact Sheet 5 networks, if you published back then, if you published a magazine, a zine that printed poetry and you got listed in Fact Sheet 5, your mailbox got stuffed pretty fast with people sending in submissions and stuff. And, you know, poets can be pretty surly. So I remember having a lot of like long distance flame wars through the mail with poets who weren't happy about the speed with which I was accepting or rejecting their work and stuff like that. So anyhow, I saw Dirty Plot and I was just like, I could do a magazine just like the old days, like Hogarth or whatever. I could do a zine that's just all my own stuff, and I don't have to worry about rejecting people or accepting submissions or doing things on another person's timeline and things like that. And so once I started King Cat, Kosoiko lasted another couple of issues, but once I got a taste of doing that, my own work, my having my own magazine of all my own stuff, that became my focus right away.
It's interesting hearing you talk about it in that way, and especially that moment of like mediating with Zozo, it was called,
Mm-hmm.
with
Yeah.
mediating like people's reaction to you through this publication. And then that combined with this experience of Fact Sheet 5, do you think a bit of what you, that those two things together became so important to you? Do you feel a bit of Spit and a Half is like, providing that service that transformed your life? You're providing that in today for
Yeah.
other people?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I started Spit and a Half, which was like 1992, it was when like I had got tired of doing manual labor jobs, and I had this idea like, oh, I can do have a company that sells zines through the mail and comics mostly. Most of my friends were making comics. And so yeah, right away. So it was like partially like altruistic, like, oh, there's all these people making, all my friends make these cool zines or whatever, and like I can, people put them all in one place, and people can send one check in the mail or send a $20 bill and get, I mean, the zines back then, they were 50 cents or a dollar or whatever, get a huge stack of things in the mail. Um, but then it was also partially just like, I don't want to like drive a forklift anymore. Like if I can like, if I'm selling King Cat at 50 cents a pop, that's okay. But if I can like get an order for King-Cat and Jenny Zervakis's books and Tom Hart's books and Dave Lasky's books and all these people, um, and I take a modest cut, then maybe I won't have to drive a forklift for the rest of my life. And so, but I mean, right away, it was that feeling of community where um it really did feel like a family. Everybody got to know each other, even if you didn't get it. Even if Dave Lasky didn't know Jenny Zervakis, pretty soon they did, right? Because there was this little hub that they were all connected through. And I did, and I'm sure you have this feeling too with Domino, Austin. I got a thrill out of taking all these comics that on their surface looked really different, right? Chris Silla and Jenny Zervakis and you know Tom Hart and gosh, all so many people, and sticking them together in one place where it kind of was like, this is the Spit and a Half aesthetic, and it includes all this stuff,
Right.
right? And there was, even though they looked really different on the surface, there was this connecting value to them that I saw, that I knew when I saw it, right? And so that's how I would decide like what to add to this catalog. Was stuff that had that kind of special energy where it was like really personal. It was unprofessional, if that makes sense. It was just raw. It was raw stuff that people were making, um weird stuff, idiosyncratic stuff, but mostly just like personal stuff that nobody else could have ever made. Chris Silla is the only person who could have made those comics. Zach Sally is the only person who could have made those comics. And so that was the connection, was that they were all kind of these autonomous artists who did this particularly potent thing. And I loved the feeling of taking this stuff from all over and sticking it into one pot, and almost kind of in a way at times challenging the customer. Like, okay, you like this and you like this. Well, here's this other thing. I would like you to grapple with this. I'd like you to try this. And I think that Spit and a Half had enough of a positive reputation at a certain point that people were like, well, if it's in here, it's got to be good. It's got to be something that I should I should take a chance on, And so I think, does that answer the question? Yeah,
Yes.
it was a way of, it was just this extended community, this family, um and I liked being part of it. In a way, it's almost like editing an anthology, right? You're taking these artists up, they're making their own books, and you're just taking all these books and saying, here, look at this, all this great stuff. There's this, and this.
How have your thoughts, because you've been doing, there was a period where you took a, I think when I started reading King Cat, you weren't doing the distro in the same way. I remember
Yeah,
hearing about it, and then you brought it back. How do you feel today in 2024 about doing the distro versus that moment when you're talking about it almost as it's a family of people doing it, your zine family versus today? I mean, I think it's still resembles the same ethos and idea that you began it with, but you've changed as a person.
yeah. Well, so yeah, from probably about the time you saw it's probably about like 99. I think my last issue of the or my last Spit and Half catalog that was on paper was probably around 1999. And my health was so bad at the time that I couldn't I just couldn't run the distro anymore. I had to have a full-time job so I could have health insurance, and I we had to keep doing King Cat, and something kind of had to give, and it was the distro. And so for about 10 years, um, I just focused on my health and King Cat and stuff like that. And then around 2010 or 2009 maybe, or 2010, I realized like, oh, there's these things called blogs, and you can go to Blogger and you could sign up and get your own like website. And I could just post pictures of people's books, and I could do this online. I wouldn't have to print 2,000 copies of a print catalog and mail them and deal with, because it was a headache to do that. Stuff would sell out, but people would continue to send, orders for it because they had no way of knowing, everything was so long distance. So I restarted it. My health was better by that point where I thought I could do it. And again, also, I was like, I need to make money. So this will be a good time to bring it back. And so, I mean, the way it changed was that comics had gotten so big in the intervening 10 years that it wasn't just like, okay, well, there's like 25 people making weird comic zines in the country, and I know them all, and I could write them letters and get them stuff. It was like hundreds and hundreds of people, and there were publishers, and which was great. And but it was harder to navigate, you know, in the new version of Spit and a Half. And
Sorry, no, I just needed to
oh,
mute. That's okay. Sorry.
yeah. So I didn't know if somebody was asking a question. And then which
Oh, sorry. There we go. We're good.
um oh, Zozo, a reference to the urban myth. Somebody asked the question. Are you going to ask those later? I don't know.
Well, we
I
can we
don't know
can
how to
answer.
do Zoom.
Why don't you finish your answer to this
Yeah,
question,
yeah.
then we'll go over to this.
Okay. So that like what happened was there was a point where I was like, there's so many good comics now, and there's all these like small publishers and stuff. And they're really, Austin, you and I have talked about this many times. They're like, should be a real distributor for small press comics, right? For self-published things and little tiny boutique presses and stuff like that, because there's so much good stuff and the audience is so huge for it, right? And
Bigger than people think. The audience is bigger than
yes,
people
yeah, I mean, huge, all things relative, but like, and so for a moment in like 2005, I thought, well, Spit and Half can be that. And I really tried to grow it, and I started getting stuff from all kinds of different publishers that, in the past, in the early days, it was, I usually had some kind of personal connection with the people who I was distributing. And as it got bigger in the second iteration of it, that wasn't really the case anymore. Or like I'd hear from some publisher and they'd be like, hey, here are, I'd love to be distributed by you. Here are 6 of our books or whatever. And maybe, I'm not going to name names, maybe 3 of the books were like, this is not my cup of tea personally, but they're a publisher, they're doing good work, they're good people. I mean, I'm sure the cartoonists are very nice, and even if it's not my personal cup of tea, maybe I'm sure there's other people out there who for which it would be. And so, I started taking on more and more stuff like that. And honestly, this is what kills a lot of things like this is it got so big that I couldn't manage it anymore. But it never got big enough that I could like hire someone
Right.
to help me, And that's what kills businesses unless you have some kind of capital behind you or you could take out a loan or something, which I didn't want to do, And so I kind of dragged through that way for a number of years, getting more and more frazzled and more upset with myself because I'm a perfectionist. I'd like to do a good job, and I felt like I was letting people down. I mean, right now I probably have close to 100 books stacked up in my closet that need to go online, but I haven't had the time in 8 months to update the website. And I just people deserve better, and I feel I'm sure they would all say, oh, that's okay, I totally understand, but I feel bad. And so I'm 55 now, and for about the past 5 or 6 years I told myself that when I turn 55 I'm going to retire from the distro. And so I'm in the process of scaling it back, and it's going to take a long time because I have a lot of inventory. But eventually I would kind of like to get it back to that point where it is kind of a spit and a half family. And I hate to say that because then it feels like by necessity that means like some people are in and some people are excluded. And it's not even a question of taste or quality or anything. It's more just like I probably will continue this because it's too much in my blood, but I just cannot do what I've done for the past 13 years or 14 years. It's just, I can't manage it anymore. So maybe at some point it will be more like, you know, my work and Jenny's work and Noah's work and Zach's work and just this small kind of personal circle of people who have become really close to me through comics. I feel bad about that, but there would be a way for me to continue doing it without the drain that it takes on me physically.
I have a million follow-up questions to that, but I'm going to, as I said at the talk of this, me and John are having a discussion, and we really encourage anyone to interject with a question at any time. A really brilliant cartoonist, Kay Roten, who I've never said their name out loud,
Yeah.
has a question. Um, Kay, would you like to read this out loud, or would you like me to read it for you? I'll give you, let's see what they say. One
One
sec.
second.
All right, I'm just gonna unmute because uh
Yes, no,
Sure.
perfect.
Hello.
hello. Okay, so basically my first question was just kind of a general one that I just because I'm a pretty big fan of the paranormal, I guess. I
Mm-hmm.
was wondering if Zozo, the name of your first zine, was a reference to the urban myth surrounding Ouija boards, the demon that lives in the Ouija
Oh
board.
no, no, no. So
Yeah.
Zozo was importantly spelled with a hyphen in the middle, so it was ZO-ZO. And what Zozo, the word Zozo was if you write it that way and turn it sideways, it spells onion from top to bottom.
Oh,
Um,
whoa.
it has no meaning. When I was a little kid, there was a show in Chicago, the Ray Rayner show, that was like a kids program that was on before school. So like while you're getting ready for school, Ray Rayner would be on and he'd have like animals and funny skits and stuff. And they just filled all this airtime with nonsense. And one of the things I remembered about Ray Rayner was him saying the word Zozo is onion spelled sideways, and he like took the paper and turned it sideways. So I think now that you mention it, I do remember hearing about the Ouija board thing and kind of freaking out for a second, like, oh no,
It's
that sounds
scary.
horrible. And like very scary. But luckily there's that hyphen in there. So no, I didn't. It was just a nonsense word that happened to spell something I remembered from my childhood.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, that actually makes me feel a little bit better because I would have been afraid to carry that around too, you
Yeah,
know?
see, yeah, I don't, yeah, I steer away from any kind of that stuff.
Yeah.
I got
Um,
enough problems.
my second question, I'm just going to read it because I feel like I'll get off track if I don't. I really appreciate you talking about the loneliness of comics. It's something I'm teaching for the first time this year, and I'm really wanting to talk to my students about like taking care of their social needs while they're a
Hmm.
cartoonist because you spend so much time alone.
Yeah,
And that's just kind of the norm, I feel like. So I appreciate you talking about that. It
sure.
feels as though the zeitgeist of our current era leans towards isolation just as a whole, unless one specifically seeks out a community. Over the years, have you found that the indie comics community is better connected now or more isolated, as is the general trend, or at least how the trend is sort of presented?
Mm.
Personal and professional level, or if you find that it's more connected, is this one element of the specialness of comics right now? Because I feel like right now is a very special time.
Um, well, I would say, I mean, that's a good question. My gut reaction would be that I feel like people are more connected now. Um, as much as we hate it, social media and the internet and stuff at its best can provide that, a sense of connection to people, even if you are physically isolated somewhere. Um, and I think the preponderance of comics events nowadays gives people a chance to connect face to face with people who maybe they, in the past it would have been mail correspondence, handwritten letters and stuff, and nowadays it's people from online, and that we all meet up at SPX and meet each other for the first time or whatever. And so I think in that way it is more comics is more connected. But I also have a feeling sometimes that comics has become such a huge thing, um relatively speaking, right, to the way it was in the past. And I'm talking about what are our kind of comics, art comics or literary comics or underground comics or whatever you call them. And so I feel like comics as a whole has become vast, but there's little groups within that are kind of isolated from each other, right? Which is kind of weird. And I think there was an interesting point in my experience where like I was doing these weird personal comics or whatever, and there was this time, I don't know, in the 2000s maybe, where like I was palling around with people who drew stuff for Marvel or whatever, and it was like my comics couldn't be more different than theirs, right? But we were all cartoonists. I had and we all connected and bonded over that kind of thing. And I think the internet, as we've seen, one of the negative sides is it tends to splinter people into little factions. And so I think both those are true. I think that people in comics are more connected now. But I also feel like there are these splinter groups that don't really interact anymore. Like I don't really know, like right now, I don't have too many people around who like draw for the big two or whatever, and there was this little weird moment where like we were all just like, oh, we all just love comics. And it was kind of interesting. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, it's a complicated question, so it's
Yeah, and I mean the thing with people being isolated is yes, I mean cartoonists, we everybody knows the story. We all sit at this drawing table by yourself. There's no other way to do it. And I mean, I know for me too, like there's things like there's drink and draws or whatever where people would get together and draw their comics and have a beer and chat and stuff like that. And like I would go to them for like 5 minutes and I'd just be like, oh, hey, everybody, I'm leaving now. Like comics were so, especially for a long time there, it was a really, like a very heart wringing experience to make them. And it, like the last thing I want to do is sit around with a bunch of people laughing while and try to draw my comics. You know, it was like they needed to be done at home at 1 o'clock in the morning by myself, you know, and uh but like I said, and so I think there is a certain part of that that is just inherent to making comics. But again, I think like I think people have really realized that everybody knows now, like that's not such a great thing. And so you know, I think people make an effort to fight fight that kind of isolation a little bit. Like I talked to some of my friends. I'm like, we all have to go to Nancy Fest at OSU in May because, like, first of all, I have to go because it's Nancy. But like, wouldn't it be great to just like go to some place in the center of the country for like a long weekend, and it would be comics going on all around it, but we wouldn't sit at a table. That we would just hang out in a city together and have comics in the background. And so, you know, stuff like that, I think people are realizing that that kind of thing is important and healthy. I hope, but you know, I think it is good that you express that to your students, um, because there's still a lot of there's not so many perpetual myths in comics anymore because of the internet. People are pretty open about the realities of it, but you know, it helps to be upfront and honest with people about the realities of being cartoonists so that people can sidestep those problems that people got stuck in before.
and also it avoids the problem of romanticization. That's what I think kind of
Oh, for
happened.
sure. For sure.
Right?
I mean, like
And romantic.
when I moved to Denver in 1992 from Chicago, it was because it was so cheap to live there. That was all. You know, I went there to visit and I was like, this is pretty nice. I could see living here or whatever, but I didn't, you know, I didn't have any, there was no real reason for me to go there except it was cheap. And I mean, my thinking at the time was like, well, it's so cheap, I can afford to start spit in half and see what happens. And also like my thinking was like, all I do is sit here and draw by myself anyway. I could be in Timbuktu or, you know, wherever. I could be in the middle of the Amazon rainforest or something, or at the North Pole doing this, and it wouldn't matter as long as there's a copy machine and a post office. And so, you know, maybe that is part of that romanticizing thing of like, I could do this anywhere. And, you know, of course, I went to Denver and I found a really nice community and stuff and made a lot of good friends out there. But, you know, it could have gone the other way. So, but that was my thinking was like, I could do this any place because I don't need to have anybody around me except the post office clerk.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
won't take any more time.
Sure,
Thank you
sure. No,
for
that's
my questions.
There is something social about getting other people's work through the mail and you sending out yours. I mean, I think that you know, we can talk about this like isolation of cartooning, but part of your project um opens that up, you know? I mean, part of your project is about people interacting, but mediated through their art.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean that was the whole thing. You know, yeah, I could go anywhere because I make this art in a certain way that it's reproducible and it's mailable and it's accessible that way. And
And so are
that
other
I'm sorry.
so are other people's. So
Right, right, for sure. Yeah, so we're all connecting in this kind of weird backhanded way or something.
One thing I wanted to get at is, when I first saw your work in 1999, it really, I had heard about it, but then sitting down and reading the first issue that I read, um, it's the style of the art immediately made sense to me, and it kind of answered a question whether you could draw in this way in comics, and for it to communicate everything that King Cat communicates, for it to be both emotional and thoughtful, reflective in this style. And I had kind of fantasized about work being made in this way, and what it could be, and before I could articulate it really, I needed to see how you had done it. And I feel like as time goes on, maybe a question of your art style fitting into comics probably now feels more relevant than ever before. I feel like people in general now, if they saw King Cat for the first time, would say, "Oh, of course, this
Yeah.
approach." But when you began, I mean, I think one thing that doesn't get discussed so much, or that I don't think I've ever heard you answer, is how you came to this style. I mean, you do draw on a very specific, I don't think anyone really draws in the style that you draw in exactly. And I'd like to kind of hear, I know that the discussion of your work around the time, there were people who, of course, understood it, but there were also views that were like, well, this is too simplified. There were people who felt that the style was offensive to them or something like that, something along those lines. And I
Yeah.
wonder how, and of course they were wrong, but they're not wrong to be offended,
Yeah,
that's
sure.
right. Um, but I wonder how you came to this style and what you felt, did you sense that there'd be certain reactions to how it was done in that way, and how those felt to you when they would be different than what you might have wanted to hear?
Um, as far as how I came to this way of drawing, to be honest, the way I draw comics now is not far removed from the way I drew comics when I was 8 years old. You know, they're obviously more refined now, and but the idea of drawing this oval and putting two dots in it and a line for a mouth is the way I've always drawn a person in comics. There's never been another way for me. And so, on the other hand, between the ages of 8 and 20, when I started King Cat, I also was seriously looking at a lot of fine art and reading a lot of writers and being exposed to a lot of different influences. And so there, when I started making King Cat, I had been painting and drawing for a long time, like pretty seriously. Like by seriously, I mean continuously. I just was making art day and night. And so it just, I feel like it was just a natural progression of this childhood fascination with drawing people and making comics. The one thing I will say about that very quickly, which probably most people can guess, is like I did not have the background of like growing up reading Marvel comics. So a lot of my peers, people my age, spent a lot of time like unlearning how to draw comics the Marvel way. And luckily, I guess for me, I never had that. You know, I never had that kind of young obsession with some specific form of American comics. So from the very beginning, comics to me could be anything. I remember just thinking like, oh, if you can imagine it, you can just draw it. If you could see it in your head, you can put it down on paper, and there's doesn't have to be any particular way of doing that. Um, So, you know, on the other hand, I will say, you know, and if you look at King Cat Classics or something with those really early King Cats in it, it was much different. It was a little bit more abrasive. I think it was a little scratchier. It was more improvised. It was messier, you know. And that was me coming a little bit out of the my punk roots with its focus on spontaneity and, you know, immediate open unedited expression and things like that. um but there was a part of me, like I was a big enough asshole that I did get a little bit of a kick out of making comics that the reader's response would be like turn the page and then flip back to the previous page, like, okay, that's it, you know, like nothing happened here, this is a ripoff or whatever. You know, there was a certain part of my personality that wanted to challenge people in that way, of like making something that was really idiosyncratic and personal, that did have meaning, but that maybe didn't have a kind of obvious surface meaning to it. And so, from very early on, I had these ideas about how I can make comics in King Cat. And so some of it was that way, like I wanted to be willing to make a comic that only I could understand, you know, like really grok or whatever, you know. Um, I didn't want to make comics because I was interested in communicating, right? I didn't want to make comics that were completely opaque or like super difficult to read. I just wanted to make comics that felt true to me at the time as an artist. And I felt like if I do this long enough, all these little things will start to stack up and lean against each other. And maybe that comic from 3 issues ago that somebody was like, what? Maybe 3 issues later, or 10 years later, or something, they'll look at it and be like, I get it now, you know, because there's all this context that's been added to it around, for longtime readers of King Cat. So there was a part of me that was willing to kind of challenge people. And also, you know, one of a very big thing in my life was I came out of punk rock, and then I was playing in bands, underground kind of noisy bands, but I also had like a real interest in like pure pop music and writing melodies and things like that, and like messing around with classic forms of American pop music. And but there was a point where like post Nirvana where that whole world kind of got super weird, right? And it went in a couple ways. Like in certain ways, it went towards people trying to ape that, like this popular, successful style, and then it also went in other ways where people were like, fuck that, like we're going to get harder, more abstract, more intense, like less commercial. And you know, was big for me because I don't remember how I did it. Probably just read about it in a fanzine, but I sent away for the K Records catalog. So, you know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with K Records. They still exist. You can go to their website or whatever. But the K Records catalog, it was a group of people out in Olympia, Washington, and they had this idea of punk as really truly inclusive, right? Not just for like snotty teenage suburban boys, right? But for girls and artists and older people. And they had this really wide ranging sense of what punk meant, which meant basically freedom, right? And in their context, musical freedom. And which is what I always felt. That's what I took out of punk. It wasn't just, you know, 3 chords and playing as fast as you could. It was creating the mind that lets you do what you want to do the way you want to do it. And so the K Records was really inspiring to me, not only because they had a mail order catalog, which was them and Ajax Records, and there were a couple others. in the underground music scene, they had mail order catalogs for music. Those were the direct inspiration for me being like, oh, I could do that with comics, you know. But also, so K Records was famous for, like, I mean, there's a term twee, right? You know, which kind of has different meanings now than it did back then. But it was K Records bands didn't necessarily know how to tune their instruments, right? They were just friends who got together and like made a bunch of noise in an attic and recorded it on a boombox and pressed 7 inches of it, right? Which is kind of how I started out in music, was just making boombox recordings. And I started my Spit and a Half record label when I was in high school. Um, and that was like when there was a point where one of my bands opened up for Beat Happening, which was like the house band for K Records, right? And we did our like pre/slash kind of post grunge, you know, punk inspired underground, loud, intense music. And then Beat Happening came out and they played really quiet. They played out of tune. Every song they would swap up instruments every time, every song. They had a girl singer who sang in, you know, I mean girl singer in the most generous, you know, I don't mean that as an insult, obviously, I hope, but like you know, sang in this deadpan voice. Calvin Johnson, I mean, if anybody's heard his singing voice, you never forget it. It's just deep, monotonous, blah blah blah, or whatever. And they'd sing these songs about like tea parties and blanket forts and stuff like that, right? But they did it with this like total fuck you intensity, you know, of just like, this is what we do, this is the way we do it. If you like it, that's great. If you don't like it, there's a whole other world for you, you know, but thanks for listening. And I think there's a certain element of that K Records thing in King-Cat, especially when it started out, where like the comics that were, you know, Fantagraphics comics and stuff that were being published were, you know, it was like Pete Bag, right? Like kind of snarky, sarcastic, satirical things, or like those early 8 balls, right? Which were just like so devastatingly mean and funny. I mean, hilarious, right? But mean and kind of cool, you know? And I didn't want to make cool stuff, right? Like at a certain point, I was like, I'm done being cool. I don't want to be cool. I don't, what I started to see was cool was this shield that you put up in front of yourself to protect your vulnerabilities, right? And I was like, that's not, I'm not going to do that anymore. And so, in a certain way, King-Cat, especially at the beginning, it was I was intentionally trying to create something that was open, you know, and that was not non-threatening, but like just I don't know. I can't describe it. If somebody out there could probably describe it better for me. I wanted it to be something that was not cool. I wanted it to be something that was honest and real without putting on this mask and jumping up on a stage and like being like, I'm smarter than you, I'm cooler than you know, I know better bands than you do, or whatever. It was like, I just want to go on stage and be myself and make art. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And so, you know, that was some of the thinking behind um, those early days of King-Cat. I mean, it was similar. So then the band that I had during my King-Cat years primarily was this band Felt Pilots, which again was, I wanted that band to be similar in effect to the King-Cats, where it was just like, we're just going to use like really plain, simple chords. We're going to play quietly. We're not going to try that hard to be the world's best singers. And we're just going to try to make honest music, you know. And so that's kind of where I was coming from in those days.
What about people's reactions to that when it
Oh
first?
yeah. So I mean, obviously, a lot of the reaction within the zine world, it was always fine, right? Once there's a certain point in the 90s, like there was this tide that was slowly turning, right? Where it was like people in the self-publishing world were making comics that were as good as or better just in terms of art and expression and those kind of core things than the stuff that was being published by Fantagraphics or maybe Drawn and Quarterly at the time. And then like all those weird publishers like Slave Labor Graphics and stuff. And, you know, there was this undercurrent of self-published zines, and gradually people in the larger overground comics world began finding out about them. And it kind of just got to a point where like this stuff was so good that if you were a fan of comics in the mid 90s, you had to find this stuff and read it, right? It was like you had to, if you were a comics fan, you had to know about James Kachalka or whatever, right? And
Lightning Rod.
yeah. Um and so within that larger world of comics, there was a great deal of resistance. You know, I mean, countless times people told me like the usual, just silly, like my 5-year-old kid could draw this good, you know, and I'd just be like, that's great. I love it or whatever, you know. Or like I remember one interview where somebody was like, so like, but you could draw good if you wanted, right? You know. So there was a lot of that stuff, and it took a while for people just to kind of get it. And I don't know if it's just exposure over time, or there just kind of was people started seeing more comics that were like that, and they're like, oh, okay, comics don't have to look a certain way or be about certain subjects. um but yes, there was a long period of people who didn't get it. I mean, like one of my best friends, Zach Sally, the cartoonist. I mean, famously, he loves to talk about it. When he met me, like the day he met me, he was like, "Who is this fucking pussy?" You know, it's just like, and then we became like best friends. You know, and there were a lot of people that I would get letters, you know, where people would say like, people told me to pick up King-Cat, and like I found a copy and I read it and I thought like, this is kind of stupid. What is this? And then like 5 years later, somebody said, oh, you should really check. And I was like, oh yeah, I should check it out. And they got an issue somewhere and it was still stupid and they didn't get it. And then like 10 years later, they picked one up at Quimby's and were like, all of a sudden they understood, you know.
But
So
that speaks to something about you, John, where I think a lot of people with the with some of those reactions that you were no doubt getting in the beginning, so many people, I would probably argue most people would buckle under that kind of reaction and say, I have to rethink how I'm doing things. But I really, I mean, there's been an obvious evolution to what you do, but the core of it has been refined, but not changed or not, you know, I mean, I really think the radicalism of how your art began and how it's retained that is to me under discussed, and it really speaks to an aspect of your artistic personality.
well, thanks. I mean, I would go and say like, I think part of it is just the background I came from, which was punk in the zine world, where it was just like, if 12 people like this, that's fine. You know, like I really don't care. I'm not trying to be some kind of success on a mass scale. I'm just trying to make something honest and personal and share it with people. And if they get it, that's awesome. Kind of like, you know, I was saying about Beat Happening. If they like it, I'm very happy. And that's what I want. I want people to like it. I want people to connect with it and have some kind of communication happen. But I'm not really interested in that other stuff. Um, um, and so, and I also like, despite my low self esteem or my my problems in social context and stuff, which obviously got better over time, you know. Um, I I felt like King-Cat was good, you know. I felt like my comics were good, and that's all I really cared about. If other people didn't think they were good, I it didn't. I'm trying to think of it like sometime where like a review hurt my feelings or something, and luckily I don't think it ever did. I mean, in a way, it was kind of like, if anything, it was probably that thing of like, okay, well, eat shit because I'm gonna do this anyway. I'm not gonna stop or whatever, you know. Um, and so, you know, I felt like it was good. I mean, what I was gonna say too is like when I started out, I let anything through. I didn't filter myself at all. So like I made a lot of terrible comics and even printed them in King-Cat, you know. It was just like I looked at it as a learning experience, you know, like I'd make something and it was a page of King-Cat. And when I had 12 pages, I'd make an issue of King-Cat at the copy shop. And then, you know, a little bit later, I'd pick it up and look at it, be like, oh, this comic was not very good, was it? But I still did it. Um, and I allowed myself to kind of learn from it, you know, and I didn't know how to make comics. It was all intuitive. So I'd look at a comic, I'd be like, oh, like this came out way better than I thought it would. I wonder why. Or this came out terrible. I thought this was going to be a really cool comic and it's just awful. I wonder why. And which is something that I talk to my students a lot about is like you have to get rid of that perfectionist voice when you're trying to learn to do something, you know. Um, the best way to learn how to do something is by doing it and failing, quite frankly. Because when you fail, it makes you look at your work and think critically about it and try to understand it. And so, you know, I always, a lot of times in my workshops or something, I'll have a student come in that's like, I've been working on like the first book of my trilogy for the past 3 years and I'm on page 6 and I just can't get past page 6. I keep starting over and stuff. I'm just like, just try to make a 1 page comic and finish it, you know, and let it be what it is. And then do another 1 page comic. Maybe do it, or maybe do a 2 page comic. Like, don't make your first comic 1,000 page epic graphic memoir. You know, you're just setting yourself up to fail. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well,
Yeah. So like when people would be, you know, I mean, the thing too is like by the time people in the larger comics world were criticizing my inability to draw a horse or whatever, um, I already had like a readership and a whole community in the zine world that we were like arm in arm. And, you know, so those people had no problem with the way I drew a horse. You know what I mean? So
in
it
fact,
just kind of,
it transformed them, you know. They weren't just
sure.
fine with it. It was deeply meaningful to them.
Yeah. I mean, one story that I probably tell too much, but in case somebody hasn't heard it, is like when I was young and I wanted to be a musician, the first music that I listened to and really loved after the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and Billy Joel was the Beatles. And I became obsessed with the Beatles. I was one of those like preteens who was like psychotically obsessed with the Beatles. And and then I discovered punk rock and I was like, oh, I want to be in a band, and went and got a guitar for my birthday. My mom bought me a bright yellow guitar for my electric guitar for my birthday. And I was like, I was listening to bands like Husker Du or whatever, you know, with like one of the world's greatest guitarists, Bob Mould, playing. And I was like, I'm playing these out of tune strings through a gorilla amp or whatever. It sounded hideous. I was like, I don't know why, because I have a guitar just like Bob Mould. Why doesn't it sound like Husker Du? And then I heard Flipper, which if you haven't heard Flipper, I encourage you to go listen to that band Flipper right now. Um, and so Flipper was like famously like their songs were just like 4 notes repeated. It was like boom, 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 boom. And it would go on for several minutes. And there was like a squall of feedback and just these repetitive, slow churning kind of things. And then they had two bass players because neither one of them was like good enough to sing and play bass at the same time. So when like Will was singing, Bruce would play bass, and when Bruce was singing his songs, Will would play bass, and they just traded off because I couldn't do both things at the same time. And when I heard Flipper, I was like, it wasn't the Beatles or Husker Du, right? It was like, uh, I can absolutely do this. Like I'm already doing this, right? I can play three descending notes for the 10 minutes, like really slowly or whatever. And of course, later when I became better at making music and stuff, I look back on Flipper, I'm like, it's not that easy to do what they did, right? Like a lot of bands tried and failed to make music like that, but Flipper, they were able to do it. And there's like a lot of just idiosyncratic things about their music that it's a lot more complex than it would seem on first listen. But like it sounds simple enough that it's like a door opening. Like for me, hearing Flipper was the door that opened that allowed me to be like, I can be in a band. I could write my own songs. I could play music. And I heard from so many people, and it's extremely gratifying to me that King-Cat was like that gateway for them, where it was like, oh wait, I can draw comics. Like if he can draw this and it's comics, I can do it too. And hopefully, at some point they're like, oh wait, actually it's not that easy to make it look that simple, because there is a certain amount of craft and a certain amount of just like hours at the desk, right, to get there. But it looks simple enough. It looks inviting and open enough that it's like it's that doorway for people. And so when I get an email or whatever that people tell me a story like that, it means the world to me, right? Because I was absolutely in their shoes. I wanted to make art. I wanted to be creative, but I didn't know how. I maybe didn't even think it was possible. And then something happened for me that allowed me to like see, oh yeah, you can do this. And so yeah, that's my little tear jerky story about Flipper.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Adam Kane had their hand raised. Adam, do you want to ask a question? I can unmute you, or you're unmuted.
Yeah. Hi, John.
Hello.
Really love your work, and I was curious if you could talk about like the role of emptiness in your work, in the sense that, as like even just stylistically, there's a lot of kind of open space, and like I can tell there's a love for spareness, and you were just talking about how like the simplicity is inviting for people in a lot of ways. But I was curious, like how that, because I do think that's like it's deceptively simple, but really hard to like strike a right balance of how much to include in a comic and what to leave out. And you were mentioning earlier how your earlier comics, you would just kind of put things out there, just sort of put down, whatever you had made and
Mm-hmm.
in a comic and just put it out there. And I was wondering like what your process of, sort of judgment on what to put in and what to leave out, like how you, is that just an instinct that grows over time? Is it something that, yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
if you
I do think, even though it's probably not a very satisfying answer, I do think it's just kind of an instinct that grows over time, right? It's like, man, I could remember sitting in study hall in what either was sixth or seventh grade and drawing some like Bloom County ripoff comic. And I don't remember what it is I was exactly drawing, but I like drew this arc of a line. I was like, holy shit. Like, look, I drew this line. It I had superseded the arcs of my childhood, you know, the arced line. It was like there was a certain completeness to this line where it was in the right place. It had the right kind of arc to it. I'm not going to be able to describe it really well, except that like anybody who draws a lot has those moments where it's like all of a sudden it's like the universe unfolds before you, right? And it's just like, I don't know how I just did this, but it's right there on paper, like it happened. And it was such a beautiful feeling. And, you know, I think it's like trying to find that feeling, trying to develop it. I don't know if you could figure it out in terms of words or explaining it. Obviously, I'm not doing a very good job, but there's a certain feeling that happens when you make the right line in the right place at the right time. And that's probably a feeling that I looked for, you know, and eventually grew to kind of intuitively know where it was. Like I say this a lot and it sounds a little highfalutin or whatever, but I do like I see the comics on the page before I draw them. And feel like my process is just trying to bring this thing that I see in my brain and put it on paper accurately or as closely as I can to what I'm seeing in my head. And then I think just like anything, the more you do that, the more you try, um, eventually you can't help but get better at it, you know? And so, I mean, as far as the sparseness of my work, I mean, and again, if you look at King-Cat Classics, the first 3/4 of that book is kind of just like, I'm just experimenting. I'm trying all different kinds of things. I'm using markers and brush and ink and pen and ink and whiteout and pencils and stuff. Just trying to figure out what works. And I just think I always was attracted to simple things, you know, despite my love of the Beatles and, you know, prog rock. Um, the stuff that the art that really hits me is stuff that is pretty minimalist and pretty austere, whether it's writing or film or music or whatever. And so I think it's natural that I just gravitated towards this kind of sparseness. You know, and some of it is an intentional refinement. I shouldn't say intentional because it's more of a feeling, but, and I've talked about this in other interviews where like, you know, in the early days of King-Cat, if I was drawing a scene and it took place at night, I'd get out my brush and my bottle of ink and I'd make the background all black because night is black, right? And so you have to put that in to show the reader that it's night. And at a certain point, that didn't feel necessary anymore because in my mind, it was like the reader's reading this. The first section, the first panel says, one night last week, right? So the reader already knows it's night, right? And they already know that night is black. So the reader is filling that in. The reader is putting the comic in the context of all their experience. And so if I don't include every leaf on the tree, or if I don't paint the background black, it doesn't mean it's not night because I just told the reader that it's night and they know it is. And so at a certain point, like putting all that ink down to make a dark night sky seemed something extra that I didn't need to that didn't need to be there. And so, you know, and I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. I'll go with that. You know, when I talk to my students a lot, I talk about cartooning as writing, in that you're using like these abstract symbols to communicate. So when you're writing, when you write ABC or whatever, these are these abstract physical visual shapes, and they have no inherent meaning, at least not anymore. I'm sure if you went back to the very first alphabets, they're like based on, visual things from the aspects of the real world. But a C in itself has no meaning. The letter A has no meaning. T, these two lines, it has no meaning. But when you put them together and you become proficient in reading, you understand. Okay, cat, C-A-T. Those letters in that order mean cat, and I know what a cat is. Right? It's the furry thing that in the kitchen. And not only that, but when you read, you bring in all your experiences of cat to that, right? They're fuzzy. They have teeth. They have puffy tails. They have claws and they'll scratch you. They eat tuna fish. They hang out in garbage cans. They sit on fence posts and people throw shoes at them. And all that stuff is in the reader. And just by making that simple CAT, you and the reader are accessing all that. And that's what I try to do with my drawings in King-Cat. I try to present enough information that the reader can perceive what is happening, but not so much information that I'm telling them everything, if that makes sense. I want them to bring all that extra stuff that they've learned and have stored, all this memory and association, to the drawings themselves the same way they do to the writing.
Thank you for
and for that doesn't mean that, like, if I draw a cat and I draw every hair on it, like some people do, that, like, oh my God, that's too complicated. I don't understand what that is. Obviously, people know it's a cat, but for whatever reason, I'm like interested in, like, what is the essence of that you could put down and have that kind of communication happen.
There's that phrase by David Lynch that gives room to dream or something, where you kind of give the reader some amount of freedom to do something with it.
Sure. Yeah. And
It's
that's important. That's kind of important to me. I don't know why, but I mean, I think because, and it's part of the reason that I love zines so much, is that there's a certain kind of give and take between the reader and the writer in the zine world. It's not like, and I'm sure obviously Stephen King gets fan letters or whatever, right? And maybe he even responds to some of them. But what I liked about zines was that I was able to communicate my creativity in a way that reached people. And that also was kind of encouraged them to, like, I love when I get a letter after New King-Cat and they're just like, oh, the article about playing, Donkey Kong at the 7-Eleven. My God, I remember there was this one 7-Eleven down the street from us, and they had like 3 machines, and it was so awesome. And we used to ride our bikes there every day in the summer and stuff. Like that's what I want. I mean, I can't now, don't go out writing me emails because I can't answer them all. But that's what I like. That's what I think is a core part of why I do these things this way. I want the reader to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for that question, Adam. That was hearing John answer that. I've never heard him go into that level of detail about certain aspects of his art. So I'm very grateful for that question. The cartoonist Nate Garcia has a question. I can read this for you, Nate, or would you like to read it out loud and you can unmute yourself? Can wait a moment. Well, I'll read the question then.
Okay, doke.
Nate's question is, do you find it difficult in an increasingly, oh, maybe there's a new message. Oh yes, please read, he says. Um, do you find it difficult in an increasingly unaccepting world of comics where there is so much fighting the longevity of the medium, financially and socially even, not that that matters. Do you find it difficult to retain a fire in the belly to keep fighting the good fight? That's a good question.
Well, the fire in my belly is like a lump now. It's like I mean, I've tried to quit making comics many times. Especially, I mean, if you read my stuff, you would know, but I went through about 10 or 12 years where I had crippling OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and it just, life in general was brutal, but like making comics was just a horrifying experience. It was so hard. And I always thought like my life would just be better if I didn't do this. But what I realized was that even though comics makes me crazy, not making comics makes me more crazy. And so um, sooner or later, something happened. It's like, I got to do a new King-Cat, you know? Just an offhand about OCD too, something that I discovered through experience was that like, when you have OCD, that the disease focuses on whatever you're focused on, right? So if I'm sitting and trying to draw a comic, it's focusing on this comic and it's telling me all kinds of lies about this comic, like, and making it a very difficult process. Um, and so it's nice to think, well, if I just did do comics, I wouldn't be obsessive compulsive anymore. But the truth is, like, if you were a dentist with obsessive compulsive disorder, you would be obsessed about dentistry, right? You'd be obsessed with the person's mouth and like, did I put that filling in right? You know, and calling them. I know it's 3 a.m. patient, but like, how's that filling? Because I have a feeling, could you come in tomorrow and let me check it? Because I have a feeling I put it in backwards or whatever. If you were a plumber, you'd be obsessed about whether your pipes were leaking. And so I realized with the OCD, it wasn't so much about comics, it was just about OCD. And luckily I was able to get through that part of my life. I mean, I'm still obsessive compulsive, but nothing like I was before. But yeah, I mean, it's hard, but you know, I'll be honest too. Like making comics is pretty cheap. Like, I mean, I bought a ream of like fancy Hewlett Packard laser paper, 8.5 by 11, like 15 years ago. And I cut it in half, and that's a page of King-Cat. So that's 1,000 pages of comics for $18, the paper, right? I buy like a non-photo blue pencil once every couple of years. You know, again, and I'm not like, I go like this with my blue pencil. But I buy cheap microns. If you take it to the copy shop, I know copies are more expensive or whatever, but you can make 10 copies, a couple bucks, you know. And that's one of the reasons that I love comics was that nobody can stop you from doing them. You know, there's no reason not to do it if you want to do it. You know, the only reason you'd not, you know, there's nothing to stop you. You could panhandle $10 and print a comic at Staples or whatever. But yeah, it sucks. And it's hard, and there's all the dark nights of the soul and stuff like that. But I think that's true of any kind of creative endeavor. I think so.
There are many, many comments here. I'm gonna just focus on there's many comments here talking about how much people love your work, John, and love the things you're saying. I am going to read one of the someone who has a question. And it's from Generosa Fiero, and they say, "Thanks for your talk, John. In the early days of King-Cat, how much of the story did you sketch out slash write before drawing?"
In the early days, I didn't think about it before I did it. I just had an idea, something would happen, and I'd be like, oh, that could be a comic. And I would go home that night and I'd sit at this old kitchen table I had in my bedroom. And I would take a piece of paper and I just start it at the top left and start writing whatever came to my mind about that thing. And I'd get to the end of the page or whatever, and that would be it. And then so it was just very improvised and very spontaneous. And I didn't go back and edit them. A lot of times, even if I found like a spelling error, I'd leave it. I was in that kind of mindset in the early days where I just like wanted it to be what it was without interfering at all, even to that extent. And uh I don't know about when that changed. There were certain things that happened, like um my memory got worse over time. And so like if I had an impulse for a comic, I didn't write it down right away, I wouldn't remember it. I think at times, like, and this, certain parts of my comics definitely relate to having OCD, right? At a certain point, I started becoming very particular about the writing, right? When I started out, I wanted it to just be perfectly conversational, like with all the ums and uhs and repeated words and things that you have in a conversation with a friend. I just wanted it to sound like somebody talking. Over time, I became more interested in the rhythms of comics, the way the text interacted with the imagery, the way you could move the reader from through the panel into the next panel, jump the gutter into the next panel, move them through a page of comics, turn the page, have that kind of rhythmic break. Um, and so and a lot of cartoonists will talk about this, right? Like the more I looked at comics, the more the possibilities for subtlety became apparent, and more the possibilities of using the um, things like panels and lines and text and pages, the page break, right, where you come to the bottom of a left paging page and move up your eye, the reader's eye moves up to the top, and there's like an inherent kind of little rhythmic break in there. And then of course the page turn, where like you move somebody through a page and they turn the page and it's boom, a big surprise or something. The more I became interested in those kind of things, um, the more I started to write beforehand, because I wanted to have a plan in place, and I'm very lazy and I don't like doing things twice. And so every cartoonist knows the problem of like, oh, I drew this great page of comics and now I'm looking at it, I realize I needed an extra panel right in the middle of it. Like Chester Brown got around that by doing his thing where he did individual panels and put them on a black background, right? And so he could physically move the panels around in the comic or whatever. And like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to redraw this page of comics. Like, not only am I lazy, but it never will come out as good. You can't draw something twice and have it. I'm going to say this, even though it's probably a lie. You can't draw something twice and have it be better, right? Probably a lie, but that's what I think. And so I wanted to it became more important to me to have an idea where I was going with my work um before I sat down and drew it. And so like at this point, occasionally I will do a just spontaneous page of comics because it's fun and it's a good exercise, and it's like you don't know where you're going to end up, so it's thrilling. But mostly, especially for longer things, I have a pretty I'll write and then I'll revise it and I'll revise it and I'll revise it and I'll revise it until I feel like everything's in place and I can start, like I said, start to see the comic in my head, and it kind of becomes tangible to me. I mean, tangible in my brain. It becomes like a whole, right? Everything is okay. I have everything I need to do this comic now, and then I'll sit down and draw it. And then when I'm actually drawing the comic and like looking at my notebook with all these crossed out things and instructions, I will still give myself the freedom. If the comic starts to take me someplace that I didn't plan, then it's like, okay, well, that's something special and I respect that. And so, I'll diverge from the script or ad lib or whatever and see what happens. But mostly nowadays, I do a lot of writing. And I draw so simply, if, unless something catastrophic happens in my drawing, it goes pretty quickly. And so, like if it takes me a year to do an issue of King Cat, probably 9 of those months are writing. 3 of those months are like taking all that stuff from the notebook and putting it on the page so I can put it in printable form. I mean, I'm always drawing. I'm always working on things besides that, or, I'm working on comics throughout the year. But it's kind of just to say it's a lot of writing and revising in notebooks and stuff. And then like a short, rapid, really concentrated burst of like putting all these pages together and inking them and making a cohesive issue.
We are at the over the 1.5 hour mark.
Holy smokes.
I'm gonna no, it's great. It's great. I'm gonna ask a question, and then David Lasky just put a question in here. As I ask my question, we'll do mine, and then we'll go to David. And then if anyone else has a question, now's that we can maybe do one more after David's, or maybe two more. We'll see. But now's the time to put
I
them
mean,
in.
I don't care. I'll sit here and answer every
Okay.
question, like unless it's like becomes ridiculous to everybody at some point. But
Okay, we'll keep going then.
I
But yeah,
have a little bit of water here.
now
So
would be a good time to ask a question. But I wanted to ask while you're still here. I teach a class just about issues around comics, things that can happen in comics, ways comics are made. And one of the things I do in the class is I ask my students, let's talk about this comic, not in terms of if it's good or if it's bad, that's irrelevant. Let's just assume that it's legit in some kind of way. And let's maybe talk about how it was made. That's important too. But let's try to focus on what happens to you when you read it. And then more importantly, what happens in the world after you've read this comic? What does this comic instill in you that has an effect in the world? And a comic from the past, what might that comic have done to people that has a presence and a role in the world? And maybe that's my kind of need for this medium that I've spent so much time working with to have some kind of relevancy outside of issues of good or bad, or issues of how it interacts within the world of comics. You talk about this affection you have for, you talk about not growing up with mainstream comics, but you do now. You're very interested in Golden Age comics, and you're interested in the form in general, even work that is completely counter to the work that you devoted your early life and most of what Spin and a Half does. So I kind of wonder to you what role comics can have. What are they capable of doing? And you've devoted so much of your life to them. What's something that they might be capable of doing? What's some role that you think is something that they do well, or in the world at large?
like the cat. Um, I mean, in the big picture thing, like beyond my personal uh tastes and stuff, I mean, comics can do anything, you know. I mean, that's clear. I mentioned that earlier. Like, um, there's nothing that can't be a subject for comics. Um, and for what it can do personally, though, or like in a smaller way, is I mean, I think there's something very special. And I think everybody in the Zoom call would agree. There's something special about comics that you can't get from other media or other forms in times, at times. There's something about the words and the pictures combined, that is, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time coming up with words to explain to say something so simple. Uh, it's just it's such an effective way of communicating, right? It's such an effective way of connecting. And there's just, I mean, I think maybe it's just comics people. Like there's film people and there's literature people and book people and stuff, where they just connect with a certain medium, right? Um, and for comics people, it just makes sense. Um, it's words, it's images. For me, as much as, you know, I look at plenty of comics on a screen or whatever, for me, it's also the handheld aspect of it is really important to me. Um, the physical connection with the thing you're engaging with, it's in your hands, you're turning the pages, your eyes are seeing it, you could smell the paper or the ink or whatever. That I think is really, there's an intimacy to it. It's handheld, right? I mean, as much as I love movies, it's like on a big screen or even like a TV, you know, there's like at this distance. It's it's just inherently human, it feels to me. I mean, Linda Berry talks about this a lot. You know, like there's something like almost cosmic about words and pictures. It's something that people do when they're babies, you know, when they start making marks and things. There's something primal about it. It's so intimate. And so I think that's part of its power is like its ability to connect really deeply with people. Um, what do I think comics can do in the world? I think like any kind of art, it can help us understand the world, connect with other people, understand other points of view, um, enrich our lives, right? All that corny stuff. I mean, it's all true. And it teaches us, I mean, especially if you make comics, it will teach you a hell of a lot about yourself. If you make any kind of art, it will, you know, but we're comics people. A lot of times when I do questions and answers, sometimes a common question will be like, have you ever thought about like doing animation? And I mean, no offense to people who do, but like for me, I'm just not interested. Like, why? No. That's like saying, well, have you ever considered professional bowling? It's like something different, you know? It's just comics. Comics is what I like. I like panels. I like pages. I like paper. Um, but you know, professional bowling can change the world as well. That was too hard of a question, Austin.
No, no, no. That was a beautiful answer. I'm gonna ask David, do you want to read this question out loud, or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I can read it.
Thank you.
Hi, John. This has been so great. I wish we could just do this every week because I'm feeling ready to draw comics now. But I wanted to ask because you were one of the first creators I ever saw, maybe the first, who made comics that felt more like poems than stories. And now poetry comics has become a thing, and I teach it and I show your work when I'm teaching because you're still like making comics that are just feel like poems in comics form. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your poetic influences and how they might have informed your poetic comics um, from the early days of King-Cat till now. Uh, what poets you read or inspired you, I guess.
Sure, sure. Um, well, that is a good one. Um, I was thinking about this the other day because instead of being on my phone at night, sitting in bed and staring at a screen, I have the Library of America. They have a 2 volume American poetry set, and I'm forcing myself to read poetry. Not forcing myself. I'm choosing to read poetry instead of like reading message boards or whatever. Um, and I was feeling a little scattered, but there were a couple things. I was thinking about how like in the modern world, everything is attainable instantly. Like every book that it's isn't it? It's rare. Every once in a while, I'll come across something and I'll Google it, and there's no results. I'm like, I don't understand how that can be. But I was thinking about when I was like young, we had Crocs and Brentanos, and then it turned into a Walden Books. Like a Crocs and Brentanos was like a local Chicago chain of bookstores. It was like this little suburban strip mall store. And so it's small, it wasn't like a Barnes and Noble or whatever. It was this small bookstore, but they had all kinds of cool stuff. And I used to go in there and always buy books. And that's when like paperbacks were $3.95 or something. Um, and so I would just get whatever looked interesting. But I had a book, I had like the complete poems of Robert Frost because I think I recognized the name or something. And I was reading a lot of Robert Frost poems recently. I was like, why? How can I like this? Like on some level, these are super corny, but they're just killer. These poems are so real and so smart. Um, so I didn't read a lot of poetry when I was little, except for that Robert Frost book. But I wrote constantly. I just filled stacks of notebooks and journals, and I wrote poetry and I wrote short stories. And when I went off to college, I was close to being a poetry minor, but I read a lot of poetry, and I'm probably gonna have a hard time thinking of. I mean, like it's all famous people that you would think. Wallace Stevens. I love Sylvia Plath. Um, Most of the modernist poets. Um, that's when I start to get really interested in things. Um, but I'm not a poetry expert by any stretch. Um, I find most poetry insufferable. um, but I did take these courses in poetry, and I read a lot of poetry and thought about it a lot and stuff. You know, um,
Can I just interject, John? Can I just ask
yeah,
what, when you say you find most poetry hard or
insufferable.
insufferable? Yeah. What can you? I'm just interested what you mean because it's yeah. I don't hear critical opinions from you directed in that way, and I'm interested in that.
It's just, I mean, the kind of stuff that is I mean, if you think comics is insular, the world of poetry is just psychotic, and I find most of it's like impenetrable, it's and I'm sure that a lot of people enjoy it or find some kind of meaning or use in it, but the kind of like I can't. I don't know what to say. I'll say something terrible. It's not relatable or human scaled. The stuff that I like is human scaled, and it can be very abstract and it can be very obscure, but there's some kind of real human heart that comes through, less so than like word games or things like that. Or I don't know. I don't know why, because I try to read it and it's awful. I can't stand it. I need to something to bite into. I need to get some kind of taste of juice of life out of it or something. Um, this is a rough question. I'm sorry I'm babbling.
No, it's good.
Um, I think that, again, I think for me, in a certain way, the connection with poetry happened when my OCD started to get worse, where I became fanatical about the rhythm of the comic, and the which meant everything, not just the drawings of the panels and the way the pages are laid out, but especially the text. And in the same way that a poet would, where it's like, um, the sound of the words, the way the words sound when they're placed next to each other and read consecutively, the alliteration, the syllables of the words, right? The rhythm, the patterns that happen in written words. I've spent a lot of time like trying to come up with a 3-syllable word for tree or whatever, that begins with a soft sound, soft letter. Um, I became really focused on these subtleties, and it reminded me of poetry. It reminded me of the way a poet thinks about constructing words, or can think about them, because obviously there's all kinds of poetry. Some of it is very free and conversational. So like Chris Ware, a lot of cartoonists will talk about comics, they feel like it's like connected to music. And so for me, I think they're right. I think it's another way, like when I say I see the connection between poetry and comics, um, it's that poetry, comics, music, like film, like a painting, you obviously stand in front of it and you take it in, and you can spend a lot of time in front of a painting, and there's a time thing. But in these other art forms, the creator is moving the reader or the viewer through time, right? The reader starts somewhere and they end somewhere else. And the artist is like using all the tools of their trade to guide the reader through that. And so I began to have, the comics sounded a certain way in my head, and I was trying to figure out a way to put that down on paper, so that, like, to guide the reader, like, okay, this flows like this, it flows here, it flows there, it flows there. I wanted to create this kind of flow through the comic. And so that reminded me a lot of poetry, in the way that poets use the little principles of poetry, the line break, the stanza, repeating elements, you know, when you get into haiku and stuff like that, but even free verse, there's just the rhythms of the words. To me, comics for a long time became all about rhythm, and creating some kind of rhythmic experience for the reader. And so that's how I felt the connection to it with poetry, because I think I think of poetry a lot of times in that way. It's like it's full of signs and symbols and techniques that affect the reader's response in a rhythmic way, and also in a conceptual way and stuff like that too, obviously. And you're telling a narrative story in some cases, but in general, I started looking at a comic as a poem. And I started writing a lot of poetry then. This would have been like late 90s, early 2000s, which happens to be also the time I started reading a lot of Asian poetry, classical Chinese poetry, Zen poetry, and stuff like that. And so obviously that's anybody who looks at my stuff can tell that kind of writing has had an impact on it. And so I was writing poems, and I was interested because sometimes they felt just like a poem and sometimes they felt like a comic. And I became interested in using comics as a way to trick people into reading poetry, because, like I said, most poetry is insufferable. So when you like walk up to somebody and say, here's my new chapbook of poems. Would you like to read it? People's first response is like, okay, buddy. Like, I just saw something really important I have to do that isn't reading your shitty poems. But when you give somebody a comic, they're kind of just like, oh, a comic. Wow. Oh, look at this, And so I'd take a poem and I'd figure out a way to put it in comics form. And then it's like, to me, it's like those suburban housewives who like grind up cauliflower and put it in the kids' applesauce, right? It's like you trick them into eating cauliflower. It's like, you don't know it, but you just read a poem, you know? And so I think of it that way too a little bit. I think that's one thing that comics is good for, is it makes certain things more palatable. I have a friend who is a fantastic writer, and he's also a musician, and his writing has gotten no traction whatsoever, in the world. He's had a couple chapbooks printed or whatever, but his music became quite successful. And I was like, that's because you're taking your poems and you're putting them to melodies, and they've got choruses and there's like a guitar solo, and you're force feeding poetry to people who aren't, because you're mixing it in with the applesauce. And that's the way I think about like my poems and my comics and the way they interact. Sorry, that was a kind of a bad answer. That was a tough one. Was
Well,
there?
you know what it made me think of? I also feel there's something that you care about in your own art and maybe in poetry that I think that you tend to want things to be useful in some kind of way. I remember
Yeah.
there's something in a King Cat that I always remember where you're working in a health food store and it's one where you're using kind of a poetic narration and you're saying looking for answers anywhere, on
Oh, yeah.
even on a
The back
box
of
of.
the tea box.
Yeah, I think about that all the time because there's a criticism of it like this is what I'm driven to, but it's also very like if this is useful, I'll accept this. If this
I'm a good,
on the back of a tea box is useful, I'll make use of it.
yeah. I do think part of it is cliche, but I do think I'm a good Midwesterner. Like it's all about practicality and usefulness and thrift, stuff like that. Uh, yes, poetry is good. I'm one of those. I'm one of those Poetry is for the people. People. I'm not so much interested in the poetry that's for other poets, like that's designed to impress people who know what they're looking for in a super complex, impenetrable kind of piece of writing. You know what I mean? I'm about communicating. That's what it always comes down to. I was gonna say, because I'm looking on the screen, there's this grid of boxes. Some have pictures and some have video screens. And here it says Scales is one of the viewers, and they've got a picture of Sluggo from Nancy. And Sluggo's holding a book up to his face, and it says "How to Fix Things." And when I was talking about Robert Frost and going to the Walden Crocs and Brentanos or whatever, and oh, here's a book by Robert Frost. Okay, I remember in that same store going and being like, oh my God, here's the best of Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy, right? That old, who was it who put
Walker.
that out?
I think Brian
Walker.
Walker did it.
Brian Walker.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and I read Nancy in the comics, I didn't read comic books, but I read the newspaper comics. And I was like, oh, Nancy, this is great. This is kind of corny. Like it's this little kid with a bow, right? And I like Nancy. My first tattoo is of Nancy, right? And it wasn't until a few months ago I was reading a Bill Griffith's book, The Three Rocks, which is really good. I really loved it. And I was like, holy shit, I stole my drawing style from Nancy. Like I everything about Nancy is how I draw. Like the way Bushmiller draws a lamp on a table with a couch and like half of a open window with drapes hanging down or whatever. I've fucking copied. That's where I like it blew my mind. And I went back, I like looked through some old King-Cats and I was like, holy shit. And it's from that book, right? Because there was one book of comics in the store, and it was that one. And so I got it and I memorized every inch of that book because it was the only book with comics in it. I had a couple Doonesbury books too, which I bought because they were comics. I did not understand them, you know. I didn't understand all the stupid East Coast politics and shit that was in Doonesbury, but I was like, well, it's comics, so I'll get this book. Plus, paperback books were like $4.95, right? I remember when paperback books started being $20. It's like that's not right. Anyhow, so that I both the Robert Frost book and the Walden books and stuff, and then that little picture of Sluggo reminded me of like how these just like these kind of random things just like, well, it happened to be in the bookstore. I recognized it from the Tribune. Nancy, I'll get this book. And then like 50 years later, 40 years later, I guess, I'm like, oh my God, this, I mean, of course I love Nancy. I mean, I'm like one of the biggest Nancy proselytizers, but I didn't realize how much I had ingested and digested of that book. And it was just because was the book they happened to have on the bookshelf, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and you made use of it.
Yes, I sure did.
Maybe this will be the last question, unless someone asks one while John responds to it. This is from Nate Garcia, and he says, "How does Bob Dylan influence your work, if at all? And do you have any thoughts on the upcoming Timothy Chalamet starring as Bob Dylan movie? I am asking objectively, even though Hollywood evil dollar signs is all that I can think of, but it is beautiful that American history like Bob is being dramatically portrayed. Thoughts?"
um, well, so Bob Dylan is very important to me. It's
I
way
remember
up there.
when the Chronicles book came out, I think I remember hearing maybe you wrote about it.
Yeah, that book unlodged like a 5 years writer block in me. I mean, I was making comics during that whole time, but like I said, it was like I was killing myself, pulling teeth to make comics to write. Um, and I think we all know too, probably like half the stuff in Chronicles is total bullshit, right? But it doesn't matter because the stories are so good. And I mean, Bob Dylan is nothing if not like a mask, right? It's a persona, right? So every time you encounter and engage with Bob Dylan, you have a persona here. So I don't want to put too much into reading his book, like in terms of like, oh, Bob explained all this stuff to me. It was something about just the way it was written and the way he talked matter of factly about creativity in that book and like the creative process and the way he went through peaks and troughs and things. Like I said, it broke some kind of dam inside of me. I think after I read that, I did like 5 comics in 2 years, which is unheard of for me. Like at that point in my life, 5 issues of King-Cat, and so yeah, I mean, when I was young, I listened to the Beatles and New Wave, and then I discovered punk, and like there was the whole thing of like I think Bob Dylan's a hippie. So at some point I got Bob Dylan's greatest hits. I taped it off my friend, and that's where it began. And I mean, Bob Dylan is very interesting to me, not only for his creative output. I mean, when Bob Dylan dies, it's going to be like the Library of Alexandria being burned down, right? I mean, it's scary to me. Like there's so much inside that he must, it's like a steel trap mind, right? Like he has everything is in there.
Oh, you mean all his secrets or all his the real?
Everything. I mean, all these obscure tidbits about American history
Oh,
and the Bible and um old blues people and American literature and world literature and poetry and art and film. I mean, the guy's
well, also the mystery of him, what the you know.
well, but when he writes something and presents it in public, it's like unrolling some scroll, right? And it's, I don't want to put too much on it because he's not infallible, right? And that's what I was going to say. Besides his creative output, is he's interesting to me as an artist who's sustained a career through a long life,
Yeah.
right? And who has openly and honestly weathered periods where he had to fight to write a song, where he put out shitty stuff and he knows it, but that's what he had at the time. And it's he taught me just a lot, just looking at his career, and has taught me a lot about how to sustain oneself as an artist. I mean, obviously, he has a different set of financial situation stuff than most cartoonists, but in terms of creatively and like with, he's kind of protected himself in a little way, that his real self, right? Where I don't know, are there any people on the planet who know who Bob Dylan really is?
Yeah.
But I think about it in terms of like sometimes I'm doing a new King-Cat and I will admit, like to me, I'm like, this isn't that great. It could have been better in some way, but I don't know what that way is. But this is the new King-Cat. And in order to get to the next one, I have to go through this one. And, inevitably I put it out and I get a letter from someone and it's really interesting to me. This would be interesting, I think, to cartoonists to hear, but a lot of times there's a comic where like I'm on the fence with, I'm like, I don't know. It's a little too stupid or a little too abstract or a little too navel gazing or something or a little too whatever. And then I usually default to like, well, there's a reason that I drew this. And so it goes that king that shitty comic and be like, uh that was the best comic I've ever read by you. Like it meant so much to me. Like I photocopied it and blew it up and hung it on my wall. And so that's kind of something I got from Bob Dylan too, where you don't always know the value of what you've done, but you kind of trust the process.
Well, maybe that brings up something to me that maybe we could end with this question. There's a story about, well, it's indirectly about Bob Dylan in that big Neil Young biography. Maybe you've read it, Shaky. Did you read
Yeah.
that?
Yep.
There's
I
there
mean, Neil Young, I love Bob Dylan, but Neil Young is my favorite
there's a part where, because
musician.
there's interviews in it, they print interviews in it, and there's this one interview that I always tell people about because I think it shows a difference in two different artistic approaches. And the interviewer is asking Neil Young, he's saying, well, Neil, you record all the time. You record every show and you're always putting out an album constantly. Bob Dylan says he's very afraid of recording because recording is so permanent. It
Yeah.
freezes that moment in time. And Neil Young's answer is very illuminating. He says, well, he should just record all the time because then it would be he'd be recording everything, so there wouldn't be that kind of self-consciousness about this is my new studio album. It's just like, well, it's more like how a jazz musician would operate.
Yeah.
You know, like I have this material, this is what's going to come out. Where do you feel you on that spectrum?
Mm, somewhere in between. Like during the OCD years, I was really painfully self-aware. I mean, that's the terrible part about that disease is you're aware of everything. And prior to that, I just kind of threw stuff at the wall, you know, um, and learned that way. And during the OCD years, I learned about comics by like going deeply, deeply within and almost like taking something and refining it till it was like this is gonna sound self-aggrandizing. I don't mean it this way, like a diamond or something. Like everything about it is completely perfect. Every aspect has been considered and appropriately resolved, you know, and then you present it to people. And it's two ways of working, that's for sure. I've had both of them. Um, I feel like post OCD, even though I still have it mildly, you know, um, I've been having to kind of relearn how to use the most positive aspects of both those approaches, right? So, how to be spontaneous when the situation calls for being spontaneous, how to be hyper focused on refining something when the situation calls for that, which is interesting because and I can't quote it exactly, it's a total paraphrase, but one of my favorite things that I read from Bob Dylan, it's in one of his Rolling Stone interviews, but he talks about how like during the, what's it called, the Wild Mercury years or whatever, the 60s albums and stuff, he was like channeling this music, right? It was just pouring out of him in waves. And after the, motorcycle accident, he says something like, I had to learn how to do something that I'd never had to think about doing, right? Like he didn't have to think about writing Highway 61. It just was there. He like plucked it out of the ether or whatever and put it on a record. And at some point, that kind of capacity left him. And I think it's come back to him, right, in certain times. But he weathered on record those parts of his life where he was trying to write songs, he had to try, and that was new to him. And I think so that's another way that Dylan's career has kind of helped illuminate aspects of what I've done, where I've done this long enough that I know that sometimes it's like your mind is on fire and it's like everything you're throwing down seems like it's just coming out just right, and it's all means a lot, and it's all done well to your standards. And then there's other times where you're going to wonder where that feeling ever went, but you keep going, you work through it with your art. And that's what I mean. Like some issues, it's like, okay, this isn't the world's greatest King-Cat, but it is the next King-Cat. And that's what it is. And we'll see what happens next time. And I think that's something that I gleaned from observing Bob Dylan's output, his stuff. I can't remember. Was that yeah.
I was going to say with that refinement and the the distilling of ideas and all that, at least with writing, that's where you get really good material, then and and it takes a lot of work, and that's why there's like mentioned about the insufferable poets. That's because they don't realize how much work it really takes and how much time it takes to produce really good poetry.
Yeah,
And the same with general writing or even writing for comics that took for communicating with words that yeah, you have to be able to edit yourself and also walk away from it for a while, right? And
sure.
then come back to it a week or two later, and you'll recognize things that you didn't see before.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, some of my personal favorite comics that I've done were made in 5 minutes. It's just like something came out of me. I threw it down. I was like, hey, there it is. And then some other of I mean, there's a comic, I think it's in the Map My Heart book, but it's called Ant Crossing. It's a 2-page comic. It's like 12 panels or 11 panels or something. And it took me probably 6 or 8 months. There's probably 25 words in it or something. And I labored a great deal over that because I knew it was something that I wanted to express adequately, and it took that long. But like you said, I'd go crazy and work on it for 2 weeks, and then I'd let it simmer for a month and not think about it, and then I'd come back and look at it and say, okay, well, this part here that I crossed out, actually that can come back in and go over here, and I'll add this and then leave it for a little while and come back to it. But I think in my experience, those kind of situations, even if you're not consciously thinking about it, your brain is simmering it, it's simmering inside, and you're cooking it. You're just not, it's on the stove in the other room cooking at a low heat, and then suddenly it's done. But yeah, sometimes it's a lot of work, and that's been the trick, figuring out what, recognizing the situation and recognizing what's needed.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end things, John. And I really first I'm gonna put a link to Spit in the Half
Mm-hmm.
in the chat. And this will be when we archive this, I'll put that there as well so everyone can see not just your work, but all the work that you bring together. And this was such a beautiful installment of the symposium because it really worked how it should, where you spoke, people spoke with you, and it was just thank you so much for giving us this time with you.
Oh, sure. I hope it was useful. Useful. There it is.
Yes, it definitely was. It
My
was
my
extremely.
brain is not as hot as it used to be.
Oh,
So
John,
sometimes it's
John,
sometimes it's hard for me to come up with the right thing.
John, you know that's not true. Yeah, this couldn't have been better. So thank you so
Okay. Well, I'm glad. And so I have a question here, since I'm like an old person who doesn't understand the internet. There's all these chats and stuff. Can I
Yes,
answer these? Are there questions here that
I've read all the ones that are questions to
Oh,
you,
okay.
but there are messages for you.
Okay.
Um, and oh, someone's asking for a link to past talks, and I can just say that's if it's all on YouTube on the New York Comic Symposium channel. And I'll ask John later off camera if he wants to archive this one. Most of them are here. I can just put that in the chat right now for you. Give me just one moment. Um, but
And how long does it take for these to end up on YouTube?
it'll take me a couple of days.
Okay.
But yeah, and John, what I can say is with the comments that people gave you, I can give you um when when I export this onto my computer, I get all the comments in
Oh,
a text file, so I can
okay.
send those to you. But why don't I read some of them right now? Here's the link to the
Yeah.
symposium that
I,
has
I
the
just I
archive.
don't want to if there was a question that somebody asked and I didn't answer it, I don't want to
Let's
you know
go. Let
snub anybody.
let's be really complete here, and let's go through. So we had Kay Roten's great questions, and then Jazz Jacoby. Let's see. I didn't see this one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to belabor it, but
Oh
I'm
no no
just
no
that
no
much of a person that I want to make sure that I don't snub
Jazz
anybody,
says,
because I
John,
thank you all.
Jazz says, John, I'm just now trying to create my very first zine in my mid 50s. So I'm actually starting out close to the age where you're talking about feeling the need to scale back, spit in a half. My question is, does it remain as easy to create new work and keep that energy and time management flowing as it might have earlier in life?
Well, um, I mean, if you're my age, then you know, like things just slow down. I think about the stuff that I used to accomplish in a day when I was 25, and I accomplished that in like a month now, you know. So, but maybe you also know a little bit more about yourself the older you get and what works for you and what doesn't. And so, I always tell one of my jokes is when young cartoonists get together, they talk about comics. And when middle-aged cartoonists get together, they talk about money. And then when old cartoonists get together, which I'm considering myself old at this point, even though I'm only 55, they talk about time management. So,
or hemorrhoids.
oh yeah, sure. That goes without saying. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about zines, right? Is anybody can do it at any point, and everybody, this is again kind of sound pie in the sky, but it's really truly what I got from the world of zines is like everybody has a voice that is worth sharing, and so what better voice to hear from than a person who's 55 and is writing their first zine.
Everything else here, I believe, are just comments, but I'll read them to you now.
Okie doke.
Da, 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 da. David
Only if this is going to annoy everybody.
No, this is good. David Lasky says Spit and a Half distribution also sold music on cassette often. King-Cat was so punk in the early 90s, John could really shock everyone by writing an essay about how much he liked Fleetwood Mac.
And it did shock people. I had many long conversations with some of my punk rock friends
Scott
about that.
Spencer says a lot of your comics are about being open and aware to the present moment. I haven't seen comics do that. I just wanted to say thank you for that. Julian
Can I
responded to
say
that.
something about that one real
Of
quick?
course, of course.
When talk about like my motivations for comics, um, back when we were talking about like making comics that people wouldn't necessarily get, but then maybe later they did, or me not worrying so much about like I want to express this thing and say this thing. This question or a comment here about being open aware to the present moment is a large part of what I am trying to do with King-Cat, and I have been for a long, long time since the early days, is that um, one of my prime motivations in life from the time I was a little kid was to observe and experience in a personal and in a deep and personal way, and in a way that I will use this word even though it will turn off a certain number of people, but in a spiritual way of engaging with the world, understanding. From a little time I was a very little kid, I was one of those annoying people who was interested in all those big questions, like who am I? Why was I born? What is the world? Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? What's the meaning of life? All that stuff. And what I found was a connection to something deeper within myself and therefore a connection to the larger world through being open to these very small moments in life. So like that's why even in the early days of King-Cat, I would write a comic and it would be about walking across the back parking lot and up the stairs to our apartment, and a stray cat comes up and rubs against my feet and meows, and we sit on the back steps and play with the cat for a few minutes and then go to sleep. Like, nothing really is happening there except that the experience of it is so, it's almost cosmic. Like, there's a way of being present in that moment when those things are happening that maybe is the meaning of life. Um, and that kind of way of engaging with the world had such a profound positive effect on me that I wanted to, in some way, share that with people. And in a way that I almost hoped, like, somebody could read that comic and be like, what the hell is this? Why would you bother writing a comic about walking up 10 steps of a wooden back staircase and talking to a cat? Because I wanted to do that enough and consistently enough that people would say, like, instead of rhetorically, would say, like, well, actually, why would you want to do a comic about that? What is the meaning in that, or the usefulness of that, or the purpose of that? What does that experience mean? Because it must have meant something to the person who made this comic enough to take the time to put it down on paper. And my honest hope would be that there would be people out there who would take that comic and think about it enough that it would encourage them to examine those kind of moments in their life, in their own lives, and hopefully find that kind of deeper connection or understanding, that is basically beyond words. There's no real way to describe it, but it's there all the time as long as you can notice it, you'll see it. And so that, I mean, it sounds really pretentious, I think. But that's why I do this.
I'm going to keep reading through these. Julian,
Sorry.
oh, no, 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 please. Um, Julian responded to Jazz's earlier comment and says, all that matters is that you have the desire to do it. I'm in my late 60s and I'm working on reactivating my publishing.
Yeah. I'll
Um,
just say this too, like I'm a comics person, but I'm a zine person, really, and I love comic shows and stuff, but I really love when I go to zine shows, that's where I get super energized, because zine people, when I'm tabling at Madison Print and Resist in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have 12-year-olds come to my table. I may have 25-year-olds come to my table. I may have 45-year-old people come to my table. I may have 65-year-old people come to my table, and they're all going to ask me questions about King-Cat, pick up distro stuff and like be curious about it. And like that zine world is still so inclusive. It's completely open to everybody with no judgments. And there's no reason why at 65 you couldn't be rekindling your publishing, because you are a part of that community, and like your voice is welcome there. That's what like continues to energize me about self-publishing and zines, is that kind of inclusivity.
Stephen Gilpin quoted something you said in this talk and says, cool is this shield that you put up in front of yourself to protect your vulnerability, in John Porcellino. So a quote that you coined in the talk.
All right.
David Lasky paraphrasing John, just being yourself and making art, no mask, no stage. That was huge. When King-Cat shifted away from snarky punk comics and became unabashedly heartfelt, it showed me something new that comics could be. It shifted the course of what I was making in my early days and still guides me.
Thank you.
We had that question from Nate. And then Kay Rotten says, sometimes rejection of art just means you aren't ready to receive it yet. This is when we were talking about people's responses to your art. That's why I think people who get recommended work by others who are ready get so angry and feel like they want to make it your business. To not only survive that, but stand by yourself and your vision is so courageous. I agree with that. And then Julian was talking about that Julian was
Yeah,
focused
there
about
it is.
because that's
That's
what
what I
people
just
about
said.
the DIY world. Nate Garcia says, "Man, such a good talk." Kay Rotten says, "I call it being in alignment. It's the whole reason I draw to feel that." Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Jazz says alignment. Then we had Generoso's comment. Kay Rotten says, "Ambiguity in art invites participation. This is such a good talk." Someone had forgotten, Nate had forgotten that it was live. Travis Head says, "Thanks, John and Austin. Love the work and excellent to hear you talk about your process and values." Joanna says, "Thank you." Jenny Zervakis says, "Yes, letting the reader fill things in." To you were talking about, your approach to what's on the page. Carolyn Berman says, "Thank you, John and Austin." David Lasky has a comment there that we read. Generosa says, "Thank you so much for your answer, John." Jenny Zervakis says, "No question, just had given me a new appreciation of the process and the body of comics." Kay Rotten says that with the low barrier for entry, that low barrier of entry means anyone can connect through them and with them. If they felt that connection, realize they can forge that connection for others, it becomes almost irresistible. I can't make a movie by myself. I can't make a symphony by myself, but I can make a comic.
Yes, absolutely.
David Lasky says, with insufferable poetry, I feel the same about the fine art world when it gets really academic. Then we had
Yeah.
Nate's question about Bob Dylan. K. Rutten, and please tell me if I'm mispronouncing. I know the work. I just haven't said the name in front of
Oh,
other.
it's Roten,
Roten.
but it's all right. It would be
Your,
cooler if it was
your
Rotten.
punk name
Yeah,
is
no,
K
I'm
Yeah,
Rotten.
I
yeah.
always
But that,
mispronounce everything. Yeah. Anyway, I
no,
apologize for that.
right. I mean,
Roten.
that would happen to me, like, whenever they would announce, like, you're in public, whatever school, and then you're like sort of sitting there, and it's like birthdays today are, and then they would like list off everybody's birthday, and I would always they would say Rotten, and
Yeah,
I would like,
I don't know
so
why I'm
everyone
doing
would
that.
laugh.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you for your patience. So you said here,
I think it's common. It's totally cool.
Yeah,
okay,
Austin pronounces it rotten because he's so hardcore.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
why.
much more hardcore that way.
It's yeah. You say it's so hard to place comics, but they are anomalous. Everything, animation, poetry, storyboarding, design, drawing, writing, etc., and completely unique at once. The necessity of the effort to place them is then the thing you start to question. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Jenny Zervakis says, "You first pissed off the poets, but you redeemed yourself."
Oh, thank goodness.
Kay Roten says, that happened to me with, oh, this is when you were talking about Bushmiller, subconsciously influencing how you draw. That happened to me with Kim Possible. I was so mortified when I noticed it. And then they go on to say, you don't always know that they're quoting you. You don't always know the value of what you've done. Gonna think on that for a while. Love that. Barbara Niebert says, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Fred
Thank
Royal
you.
says, thank you. Julian says, what I miss most from my publishing in the 90s is the camaraderie with the other zine publishers around Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Kay Rotten says, like Dolly Parton, she wrote, I Will Always Love You in a Few Minutes, one of the great creative channelers. This is when you were talking about Bob Dylan plucking stuff from the air. I put in the Spit in the Half link there.
Thank you.
Rachel Peterson says, thank you so much, John. This was beautiful. David Lasky says, so inspiring, John. Francis asked for the link. Kay Roten says, thank you so much. I'm also from the Midwest, and I know the plague of practicality.
Yeah.
J.R. Lear says, thanks, John and Austin. M. Gaddis says, thank you for the depth of your answers. This was great. Drew Pancari says, thank you, John, for all your time and insight. It's heartening to hear about the ebbs and flows while still sustaining the work. Very relatable. David Lasky says, you have accumulated wisdom now. Jazz says, I relate to your words about shaky memory as well. T.E. Parker says, thank you. Very nice to hear everyone's questions and your thoughtful answers. K. Rutten says, sage like wisdom tonight. T.E. Parker says, absurdism is the way to go. David Lasky says, this was amazing, John. The Stray Cat story connecting you with the universe. And Nate Garcia says, comics forever, terrific talk. Have a good night, John. Austin can have a decent night. He doesn't really care if it's good. All right. Jazz says, I enjoyed meeting everybody here.
Yes, I did too. This was very nice. It was a little bit of community, you know?
Yeah, no, it was great. It was really great.
Yeah, I've been in maybe, I don't know, 75 of these sessions now, and this I think has been the most insightful one.
Oh,
Yeah, it
I'm
was
glad.
really,
Thank
Yeah,
you.
really
very
special.
nice. Yeah,
Thank you.
and nice to have a chance to chat with you a bit. I've seen
Yes.
you at a couple of zine festivals,
Yep.
and of course, it's just couldn't really
Yeah,
say much. There's too many people around and all that. So
sure. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I'm coming up to Minneapolis in August for the insert name here, Zine Fest. Do you know
yeah,
that? Yeah.
Well, this
So
is,
hopefully it's called Insert Name Here. It's a zine festival.
oh, that's Ryan Carey's. Yeah, right? Is that the one?
Yeah, and Joy Mayer.
But this is how the symposium used to be when it was in person most of the time. There really would be a lot of discuss. I mean, it would be more discussion with the audience than focused on the presentation. So it's hard to recreate that online. But I think, John, you really provided the tone for doing that. So thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's very nice.
yeah.
And
Good.
next week, I'll be hosting again, and we will have legendary comics critic Bob Levin. So you can register for that talk the same way you did with this, writing to comicsymposium@gmail.com, saying you want the link for the Bob Levin talk. So thank you, John, and thank you so much to the audience. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Good
Bye,
night.
John, and bye,
Great.
everybody.
Good night.
Good
Bye.
night.
Good night.